Мені завжди дуже цікаво слухати ці лекції. Я вважаю, вони одні з самих цікавих, корисних. І я би хотів розширювати, безумовно, і, можливо, ми якісь речі зробимо з Філіпом і LSE Cities в майбутньому, тому що ми розширюємо співпрацю і інші складові. Але також, дивіться, я би хотів, щоб зараз ми стали трішки британцями. В хорошому сенсі цього слова. Да? Не тому, що ми повинні мати короля і монарха, а тому, що ми повинні поважати працю інших. Дивіться, брити, і це одне з правил нашої конференції, вони не розуміють, коли під час їхніх лекцій хтось в телефонах. Давайте, це наше нове правило буде, будь ласка, якщо вам треба в телефоні побути, краще...
Make a difference. So if you sit in the back, there are lots of seats right here. This is going to help you see the slides I'm going to go through. Now, ahead of today, I was reflecting a lot in the time for their families, a lot in their also quality of life opportunities, but most importantly, constrain their economic productivity and advantages the city provides them with. The polar opposite that happens often in the same city is intensive densification. This happens to be Hong Kong with excessive levels of accessibility. Most people living here within 20 minutes get everything they need, from the job to health to education and, of course, food and daily needs. It comes with a different type of compromise, maybe. It's apartment living often. We have seen the very sad news of not getting this right over the last days from Hong Kong. But overall, of course, it is a very valuable proposition, this intense form of living closer together. Now, coming to Europe, and in many ways over millennia, certainly over centuries, Europe has tried to identify a good mix of those extremes of trying to find quality of life with also a degree of apartments that cater for a personal quality of life at home while having good access to public opportunities and amenities and parks, and most importantly, streets which people from around the world want to visit. Barcelona, wonderful example of exactly this type of urbanism. I'll come back to this photo a bit later on. Good, so that's the big picture introduction. Let's look at now urban risks and uncertainty. And a few photos which directly I'm assuming will resonate. Energy needs to be at the heart of it. Energy is something cities need, and increasingly this will all be electricity and hopefully mostly renewable. We also know that cities are very hungry for materials. Construction processes require an enormous amount of natural resources. Don't underestimate sand, for example. We all think it's abundant. We need very specific sand for our construction methods, which is not available everywhere, and certainly not the sand you know from beaches. So this has become even a commodity which has become really limiting in many urban development contexts. This is a photograph of Lower Manhattan, New York City, after Hurricane Sandy hit. And it shows you which cities were resilient because they had generators, and the ones which basically had a massive blackout because you had the electricity system being flooded after the hurricane hit the city. This agenda is now one of the biggest urban issues and prioritize. Future-proofing yourself against these shocks, mostly also through natural systems which are off charts when it comes to climate and weather events is a huge topic. And another alternative photo is this. You may remember about a year ago from Los Angeles, the fires that went through suburban areas and essentially eradicated most of the most wealthy neighborhoods of that city. There are other consequences cities are particularly sort of coping with or need to be equipped with. Migration, a lot of the shock events, and you know, of course, a lot about this, mean that you need to accommodate, sometimes overnight, an influx of people that seek refuge, but in the medium term also seek opportunities and want to contribute to these cities they have found as a place where they can be living safer. Now, if you want to bring a bit of a system into much more an intuitive overview on the risks, the World Economic Forum every year does a global risk survey. You may know this, and they differentiate two types of risks, the ones people expect within the next 2 years to dominate, and then the ones over the next 10 years. And in this overview, they differentiate, which I think is very sensible, different type of people that assess the risks. So you have civil society, you have then international organizations, people from academia, government, and the private sector. Over the next 2 years, globally, this is not about a specific country. It's a pretty mixed bag, but you can see that we have quite a lot of misinformation and worry about our political systems, as well as a bit of the green. By the way, the coding you see at the bottom, very intuitive, green related to the environment, anything in blue, the economy, geopolitical in orange, social in red, technological in lilac, or whatever you want to call this color. It is a very mixed bag of different types of risks. But zoom forward, over a period of 10 years, the top risks are almost entirely ecological and environmental. That is something which we need to acknowledge, and a lot of the urban planning and urban policy approaches are probably much more powerful addressing exactly that kind of risk assessment. So I'm now superimposing urban answers to those longer-term 10-year risks which have been around for some time and are on a daily basis being upgraded. A lot around urban adaptation, making cities future-proof against these extreme weather events and shocks. Eco-cities, which help to bring down the energy dependence. Energy efficiency is the big term here. Urban mitigation, CO2 reduction. The efficiency of cities allow us to, of course, reduce the worst outcomes of really maybe even above 3-degree increase of temperature, which would be pretty horrific on this planet. And then we get into other domains, open cities around migration and policies where you accommodate in a more welcoming way next generations from other parts of the world. Urban governance itself as an answer to the political crisis, I'll say more about this. Cities really have this opportunity of being much more closer connected with people on the ground, making the connection between government and the population much clearer. And finally, fair cities, the justice paradigm, which if you get cities right, you can do quite a lot about it. This is a chart I've shown you before. One way of thinking about what cities can do is to think about their powers and where they take the lead, where they have real opportunities. They are either politically equipped or their administrations have respective powers, or indeed they have direct fiscal opportunities. Centrally, and this is a global survey, the notion or the question of physical development, infrastructure, spatial planning comes first. And this connects so much with this long-term answer also to addressing many of the risks through the manipulation of the physical environment, starting from architecture, the building typologies, urban morphology, the streets, the infrastructure systems, and then the district and the city plan. This is so fundamentally important, and I'll say more about it. Culture, utilities, urban transport, housing also belong to those areas where cities across the world, on average, tend to have a strong opportunity to make a difference. Now, this overview on global risks would be entirely incomplete without a reference to where we are at the moment in terms of a technological transition. And we are at the moment quite at the center of two overlapping transitions, one around ecological and green technologies and another one around ICT or AI or computer digital related transitions. Any of these curves in the past have changed our cities for good. I could show you photos that resonate very specifically with one of those waves, very detectable new forms of how we live together in our cities. And it's highly unlikely that the current two curves will not alter our urban futures entirely. I think I wanted to speak throughout, but it's you who was asking, so I can't stop.
But regarding the sixth wave, yeah, what is your opinion about long term? That I don't want to hear about anything regarding to Oh, excuse me. Yes. So is it a short-term tendency or it's long-term tendency? It's like a reverse of all these thoughts.
Yeah.
Because it seems that USA want to be as much as it possible fossil fuel.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So, look, I'm not an expert in judging what's next in the US and what's next around the green technology transition. But if you look at what is happening in China, in many other committed countries, it's not going to go away. You may see less leadership from certain countries and a huge pushback from oil-oriented economies. But I think there is increasing a coalition of the willing. It was very interesting to see in Belém how Colombia is leading now a group of, I think, 80 or 77 nations that are completely committed to also phasing out fossil fuels. The EU, of course, was weakened over the last COP negotiations, but still the broad sentiment that this matters is important. And wait until some of the horrible events which many climate scientists predict are actually occurring, and I think the political agenda may come back faster than we think. But that's my personal speculation. Let me now move on and just highlight to what extent that particular digital may start altering some of these fundamental ideas of how cities serve as territories of access. Access is the ultimate public social good the city provides us with. Access to each other, access to ideas, access to goods and services, and traditionally this was very much physical. Unfortunately, and independently from any digital technologies, we have seen with cheap oil in particular a massive decrease of urban densities and the idea of living together. So while land has been over the last 30 years and is predicted to once again increase threefold over the period from 2015 to 2050, you only have a population increase of 1.5. So what does that mean? Cities, on average, globally, are de-densifying. They're losing a lot of the density advantages I have referred to before. And now comes, of course, the big argument that maybe density no longer matters as much as it used to because of the technological shifts we are seeing and the virtualization approach. And that is, to some extent, true. And we are seeing office markets being very much changed and altered. We are seeing retail economies being changed and altered, and a new sort of reliance on new forms of also communication are making a profound impact on our travel patterns. And I'm sure all of you have experienced this. But we should be very careful to not give this the complete buy-in, for a very different reason than protecting our economy. And it is about protecting our societies, which somehow, somewhere, need to be physically connected. This is an older book by Robert Putnam, who about 2 decades already published this idea around loneliness and a society fragmenting because of people retreating to their homes and no longer connecting physically. Unfortunately, it's something which is now, at least at this very specific moment, happening at scale. These are pretty horrific statistics, and I want to just translate them to you. On the left side, you see the percentage of people that have socialized with someone outside of work and education over the age groups. And you have 2 lines. You have the one in red, which is 2023, and you have one in blue, which is 2010. Look at what is happening with people that are age group 20 to 30. While a 20-year-old person 15 years ago, only in 10% of the cases would have not socialized with anyone, this has been shooting up to 25%. So that means every 4th person in Europe at that age has not met someone physically to engage somewhere and to have a good time. On the right side, this is from the American Times Survey study, similar overview, where you're then not only mapping in red activities where you're on your own and in blue activities where you're with others, but you are showing here to what extent they're increasing, top increasing, bottom decreasing, and it's exactly those activities where we are with others that are being reduced. And on top of this, if you then ask people what's meaningful, they will say it's exactly the stuff that is, and the more it's to the right, the more meaningful it is. It's the stuff we do with others in person that is most meaningful, and that's exactly what is being reduced. So cities have a massive role to play in this, not least to also overcome huge polarization. Our political systems in Europe are exposed to forces which we all worry about. And this was the moment when there was a headline news for the first time. The single biggest sort of political fraction in Europe is the hard right. And there are many urbanists and people that work on cities that can trace this back to forms of isolation, to forms of being disconnected, and no longer having the political argument with people which, even if you disagree, you are able to sit in the same room and detect and appreciate their humanity. So cities need to help us to rediscover something which I would call here urban value, to help us to appreciate that cities are fundamental for democratic engagement. They are fundamental for high-touch, high-engagement labor. And don't dismiss this. This is stuff that really matters also to our economies. They are very important for the resilience of resource and resource use because it's efficient. It's the tolerance and the accommodation of difference, people that are different from us, which cities, if they are functioning well, can help us with, and ultimately assist social inclusion and the sharing of public goods. So with this, let me now come to urban resilient pillars, really sort of the fundamentals, where you could probably quite easily now go back to the 17 Sustainable Development Goals and quite solidly extract many lessons for cities from each of those. In particular, maybe the Goal 11, the dedicated one on sustainable cities and communities, but also many of the others are ultimately all about resilience measures, future-proofing our societies. Now, the bad news is, if you look at what the global community in 2015 committed to, and you now employ the metrics where we have finally good metrics at hand and good measures, but a lot of them are not going into the right direction. In fact, we have only made good progress on 18% of these SDGs. And if you read also then the regression where we're actually going away from these goals, not least because of COVID, but also because of all the other crisis points in the world, this is becoming an indicator, a story where the resilience, not least of cities, is actually reducing rather than increasing over time. Now here, a bit more specifically, if you go into the resilient city literature, this is what you usually get. You have these key pillars starting from infrastructure, going into environmental, social, economic stability, and then governance and planning. Many networks and organizations have been set up, dedicated to the resilience framing. Initially it was ICLEI out of Europe. It wasn't Rockefeller. They came later and broadened it out a bit. At the moment, it's quite an interesting space because I believe the term urban resilience needs to be redefined and recodified, and maybe even Ukrainian cities can play a key role in this. Here comes the energy efficiency resilience story and how we can relate it to density. So this is proper evidence. What we're seeing here on the horizontal is the average density of the larger metropolitan areas of all the UN's member states. And it starts from, about 1,000 person per square kilometer and goes all the way to 60,000 person per square kilometer. You have extreme countries like Bangladesh on the very right, and then on the top, Saudi Arabia, United States, and much more de-densified countries or countries with de-densified cities. To some extent, what you're then seeing here in relation to the energy consumption, which is on the vertical, is that the lower the density, the higher the energy demand. And to some extent, that's a function of wealth. We tend to have the de-densified cities and countries on the left side here, which of course used a lot of energy in order to disperse themselves. But if you then control for wealth, which we are doing here with the red dots, these are city-states, fairly similar income levels, Hong Kong, Singapore, Kuwait, and the United Arab Emirates, you get the same story. Meaning that the compactness of people living closer together results in significant energy efficiency potentials. And they are so great that in the latest IPCC report, there was a major conclusion that we can, if we pursue compact city development actually reduce carbon emissions by 25% globally compared to business as usual. That's a massive number. Let's move on and let me give you a bit of a flavor where these efficiencies come from. They are fairly logical. What we're doing here at scale is we are mapping out the physical territory of Atlanta and Berlin, two cities that have similar populations, maybe also similar wealth levels, but entirely different physical structures and also transport systems. So the black is the built-up land at scale, and superimposed in red is the rapid rail and mass transit system. And as a result of these different configurations, if you then look at how people travel in Atlanta and Berlin, that's the cake at the bottom. You have less than 10% in Atlanta being able to walk, cycle, or take public transport. In Berlin, by now, actually more than 70% can choose those modes. And these are, of course, highly energy efficient. The accessibility idea, I said it before, access is the ultimate social good cities provide us with, and it's not just about transport, it's not for the transport engineers. That's how I was trained originally. It is actually about people that think about land use and architecture and how buildings function, as well as people that deal with social policy. And only when price, location, and connectivity come together, you're producing equitable access, access to the city, access to each other. That's still, in many cities, not well understood. Many cities operate with very distinct disciplines, taking care of one or the other, and often trading them off against each other. You build a new motorway, people disperse even further, you're not gaining lots in terms of accessibility, you're just increasing traffic flows. But cities have a lot to offer in terms of the latest practices, certainly over the last 20 to 30 years. Behind these images are innovations that have come out of specific places that often have informed practices around transportation and land use in well over hundreds of cities around the world. And whether that's doing BRT, bus rapid transit, or bike sharing, or bringing back the trams as you're keeping them also here, which I was delighted to see in Lviv, this is fundamental. And at the heart of this conversation, and this is the least convenient thing for politicians, is a really tough recognition that there is an exceptional case related to car use. Car use in cities is not something that is a human right. It's much more a privilege, and in many countries that is actually very hard to communicate to our populations, and I'll say more about how we can do this in a much better way. Car use is far beyond just utility of getting from A to B. It's about passion, it's about identity, it's about status, and yet it has enormous negative externalities, not only in relation to the environment, but about urban life. And this coming together in our streets, our children even being able to play, and this competition for space consumption is only going to increase. More people living together in cities. We need to equip our streets for the sort of climate impacts with maybe green and blue infrastructure. And we will have to really appreciate the efficiency function of our roads. We want to use them for connectivity rather than for having parking space and few people traveling with private luxury. So that competition is increasing, yet we do know if we don't get the politics right around it, we can really upset large proportions of our societies, and we have to have a much better engagement around this particular thorny issue of the future of private automobiles in cities. When we come to climate, we often talk about heat, we often talk about the issue of flooding, and we don't recognize that the single biggest risk to cities, this is relatively recent data from C40, a global network of climate action cities, is around food security. And this may be once again an area where the experience in Ukraine may be able to help us to actually understand how do you build into the system of food supply of urban areas a far greater resilience if you have global shocks, if you have regional shocks, disruptions to transport flows, and clearly the urban hinterland matters enormously. And that is understood now, again, much more, the extent to which green spaces for the protection of, in the end, citizens living at concentrated levels in urban areas, how green spaces can help us to live a much more resilient life. These are some renderings for Oxford Street. Oxford Street is going to be pedestrianized over the next years, and there are some pretty radical proposals about reintegrating nature in a hyper-urban context. I'm having a bit of difficulties with the clicker. Let me just, yeah. This photo is important about food resilience. China has also woken up to this particular issue since COVID. They are now restricting proactively urban growth in the areas around the eastern seashore, Shanghai, Beijing, where you have one of the most fertile lands in China. Many of these farmlands were eaten up by urban development. That's now being stopped much more than ever before, with a new agenda of trying to really use existing urban land for the housing and economic development needs and protect the existing agricultural spaces for food security reasons. And finally, I think for Europe, quite important that we recognize we need to transition into a maintenance paradigm. It's not about just building new. We may have even declining populations. It's much more about making sure the infrastructures we have, we're keeping them in a good shape, we're investing in them, we're repairing them, we're caring for them, and that sort of leads in some corners of the urban conversation to these ideas of a maintenance turn in urbanism. Good, let me come to the compact city paradigm. You want to challenge my timekeeping again? Thank you.
About accessibility and all things that you mentioned before. But does exist any research connection between all things you just mentioned and tax from citizens? Because someone should pay for all these benefits and public goods. So it's also interesting to understand, and it's also very relevant to Ukrainian situation, because in Ukraine we don't have a tax culture, tax-paying culture. Yeah, thank you.
Well, okay, so that is in some ways a slightly separate topic. What you're asking is, depending on the physical form, do people pay more tax or not? We're at the moment looking a bit into collaborative attitudes on the basis how people live. Do people in more dispersed settlements have more sort of collaborative attitudes, i.e. are more willing to pay for the collective versus people in more urban areas where you have the public amenities which need to be maintained? Intuitively, you would say that an environment where you know you share resources with your neighbors on a daily basis, starting from public transport, going all the way to who is watering the plants in front of your house, in the street, maintaining the park, the kindergarten, and so on, is probably more conducive to appreciating the collective and paying for it. But I have to say we don't have yet the academic evidence to underpin that claim. So let's come to a compact city policy.
May I ask a question?
I would prefer if we do it right at the end, because then we can open it up for discussion.
You have a special approach to Alexei, I understand. Okay.
All right, one exception. One last one. And the reason, just to explain, because I may cover a lot of the topics which you have questions about in following slides. But please, final question.
You didn't describe any connection between the cities and city policies and the environment where a city located in. Why? Because you can't use the same approach in European city and in Africa. You can't take the same approach in Ukrainian city and in Russia. And connectivity with a local environment like a country which city located in and region like Europe or Asia or Africa, it's probably has more influence than right governance of cities, because you could be a best mayor, but you are a mayor of some Russian city in far east, and you will not achieve any progress in your city because it's a Russia.
100% right. And it's the power of context which you're highlighting, which is so fundamentally important and underpins everything I'm saying. However, there are a few principles which hold. And when I talk about accessibility and how access is produced as a public good, that's exactly the same way wherever you are. And the fundamentals of humans coming together, being able to physically meet, these logics we have seen in sub-Saharan Africa, in our studies in Lagos, as much as in Addis Ababa, in Hong Kong, in Mexico City, in Bogota, in London, and in Berlin. So there are some fundamentals which we simply need to appreciate around the function of the need for humans to be connected and the degree to which cities can either be better or not so good at fulfilling that promise. Yeah, so really a very important point. And the best metrics for this is accessibility measures by time. We all have 24 hours per day. How much time do we require to go about our daily needs and desires to be connected? And there are certain city systems which can facilitate this much better. Now back to this photo. So the idea that a city like Barcelona, which has reinvented itself again and again in history, as in the European context a bit spearheading this notion of the compact city, has by now been really scaled and embraced broadly by a global understanding. It's in fact also embedded in the SDGs and in many of the Paris Agreement implications around compact, connected and clean city urban development built around mass transport, public transport. That's such an important element which is quite universal wherever you are. Really creates healthier, more dynamic, economically more dynamic cities with lower emissions. And on top of this, in our own surveying, particularly during COVID, the significant role of inner city areas as places of intense socialization was again and again underscored. And I think sometimes we lose hope and we think of everyone is starting to cocoon, the next generation will actually be almost entirely online connected. Well, that is not true. Many of our surveys confirm again the desire to which people that are teenagers today or in their 20s, they do want to use the city as places where they physically connect. And we need to build our cities for that connectivity. We shouldn't be naive about digital technology, and maybe it's much more like this overlay of a form of virtual connectivity at the same time as physically being connected. But don't underestimate the physical connection. So the concept of the compact city has many different interpretations around the world. This directly links to your point, context-specific interpretations. If you go to Asia, they talk a lot about transit-oriented development. In the United States, when it first emerged in the 1990s, it was called smart growth. In Europe, you have a reference to the traditional European city model. The 15-minute city has also emerged as a major paradigm out of Paris initially, but now been replicated. You have 5-minute cities, 20-minute cities, 30-minute cities. In contexts where you have more dispersed regional growth, the idea of decentralized concentration has emerged, and these are much more context-specific interpretations. What's at the heart of the compact city? You will have the slide deck, so I won't go through all the points here, but the main spatial strategy, which is here the fourth point, is about higher densities in terms of building densities, population densities, and also workplace densities. Mixed use, ideally within the same building or block, you accommodate different urban functions, but also different social groups, and then design quality. That's often neglected. If you don't get design quality right, and design in environments that are really doing us well as humans, where we enjoy ourselves in those compact environments, we're not getting it right. And on the transport side, so the second last point, I mentioned already the focus on public transport with all its extensions of sort of new urban mobility and what we now can do with digital systems, as well as walking and cycling. And here's the choice. If we design cities now for the foreseeable future, and what this diagram does, it separates out the percentage of different trip distances we are seeing in a metropolitan region. So the share of trips below 2 kilometers, sort of bottom left, the sort of share of trips which are maybe between 2 and 10 kilometers, and then above 10 kilometers. Those shares can determine the type of cities we are designing. And many urban areas in the world seem to still be on a trajectory towards an ex-urban form of almost ruining the city. of getting rid of the city, of seeing it as a constraint. I even had heard some sort of commentators talk about the tyranny of proximity, which we need to overcome. That was a big idea still up until the 1990s. We are now much more in a space, not least because of the political dynamics, where we're recognizing the proximity to each other is quite fundamental, and aiming for a high share of very local, hyperlocal trips even, is hugely advantageous for resilience, right? And this is also the COVID experience. So as a result of this paradigm, a few examples of what has happened. London, the first London plan, strategic plan after the turn of the millennium, was very much focusing on rebuilding London from its city outwards. So you see here how directly after the publication of these new planning instruments, you then had the response by the market, building the city very much in its existing core. And if you visit London, you can see this today. And then along the transport, public transport axes, both housing and also economic development follows those broad functions. A very different example of embracing mixed use comes from China. This is a district in Guangzhou in southern China, where you had originally a neighborhood which was 100% housing only. So almost a dormitory town. Now it happened to be quite centrally located, and new planning interventions then were allowing for mixed use, certainly at the ground floor. And if you go and visit Guangzhou today, most likely your tourist guidebook would tell you, visit this area because it's the most exciting neighborhood there is, with local artist practices, and you have cafes and a lot of street-facing activity, and an area which really gives space to the human rather than to vehicles. Huge success story about that particular intervention. And then two examples about how we can rethink the urban edge, which traditionally has been fizzling out, lots of small, tiny little houses. This is coming from Copenhagen, where you build a hard edge between nature and the city. Right where the city begins, you have urban amenities, starting from schools and kindergartens and cafes and workplaces. You have pretty cool apartment living, and on the other side, you have access to full nature. This has also been replicated, that principle, in Vienna. You may know Seestadt, another area I would highly recommend you visit if you ever come to Vienna. Has fantastic access to the metro system, and people in these buildings, you don't see it, they have direct access to a new artificial lake where in the summer they swim. But they live in a city rather than in the suburbs. Now let me come to a few transport observations. The modernists 100 years ago thought we just separate the city into multiple layers of different speeds. That was possible maybe for rapid rail systems where we have the underground, but when we want to activate the street, modern urbanization would suggest it's much better if we mix and we bring activity into our urban neighborhoods and streets. And if we do that, we have to have a much more sophisticated conversation. What is the right mix of different type of transport vehicles, from collective to individual, from small to large, and find appropriate shares and places for each. That requires a hard and tough conversation about the percentage of people going private, or how many trips. It shouldn't be so much about people. We should all at certain moments be able to travel privately if needed, versus public. The good city, of course, relies on the right side. And then there's the logic between speed and capacity. If you're a transport person, speak to them in your departments and re-emphasize the fundamental logic of how many people per hour in direction can you move with different transport systems, and how fast can these transport systems travel. And normally what happens here is that you are increasing here from the left side with walking, cycling, actually great capacity, but you move up towards the right. The faster you go, the greater the capacity, the more people you can move over longer distances. The car, which is in black here, is the one big exception. It can travel quite fast, but the capacity is very dismal. You're not moving many people. It looks like lots of people being moved and lots of access, but in fact, it is simply not the case. A few fundamentals on transport policy, also at the national level. Reevaluate where you spend the money. Is the money really going into urban access projects or into highway building in an urban area, which is far more problematic? It's not about more money, it's assigning them with the right type of urban accessibility. And at some point you will have to embrace road user charges. That's the one instrument which economists always highlight will ultimately do the trick, particularly if we are doing electrification of our vehicle fleets. The reallocation of street space, that's where the polarization on the ground kicks in. Some people love this transition, others really fear for the privilege of driving. And that's been an ongoing issue, and new forms of democratic engagement around that transition need to be found. Because ultimately, the image below provides you with the health a city requires, the resilience a city requires, the public life a city requires, and I think we will look back at these images of car-polluted city streets in a few decades and wonder how on earth did we ever allow this to happen. And then there's financing public transport. On the right side, you see the Bogota BRT system, which on these 2 lanes moves 40,000 persons per hour in direction. That creates access. The 3 traffic lanes with private cars, if they're lucky, you get 3,000. So we're talking about a factor differences of at least 10, if not even up to 15-fold accessibility. And how do you finance it? Well, you will probably have to explore taxes and subsidies that are generated out of car use for the backbone of urban mobility through public transport. Autonomous driving is around the corner. In London, we'll have the first trials coming to the city next year with so-called robo-taxis. And also that requires proactive engagement and making the system resilient. If it's a shared system where people can use it, whether they own it or not, it's much better than personally owned. If it's allowing for communal travel in microbuses like this one, or indeed with traditional buses, it's certainly much better than only relying on individual cells transporting one person at a time. So let me now come to the final component on city government innovation. And here we need to come back to the function of the state. I have the 5 minutes left, thank you. Good, thank you so much. Here we need to appreciate that, of course, the local democratic systems are under just similar levels of stress as also regional, national, international systems. But the city parliament and city governments have one big competitive advantage. They can build the relationship to their citizens in a much more direct way, and I want to speak to that a bit. They also can embrace new technologies, maybe in a more direct and resilient way. This is the famous Rio de Janeiro Operations Center, which brings together different departments of decision-making, from those dealing with the police, with the fire brigade, but also environment protection and control, planning, and it has created a space for synchronization and government coordination. Now, when we talk about city government innovation, this is a term which we're now heavily investing in at the LSE with our partners across Europe. We are trying to understand how public bureaucracies at the city level can generate much better urban value and embrace to some degree also experimentation more than they have done in the past. And I'm sure that many Ukrainian cities are prime examples of doing exactly that. There is one premise around the generation of urban value which is important. This is not a neutral thing. Being efficient to do whatever, that's not the story in cities. In cities, innovation around government or city government needs to serve a specific purpose about advancing what we call here urban value. And what you get then is a very complex interaction of, at the core, city government becoming more innovative through what? Well, competencies that sit with individuals, where individuals are maybe more creative, more daring, they have the tools and the capacities, they are trained to think outside the box. You then have capacities on top, which is the budget, the resources required to do new things, and ultimately then induce new actions. If this works well, to the right side, you get to new policy instruments and tools and services leading to better outcomes for residents. But all of this colorful stuff is determined by what your nation state allows you to do, what the institutional structures allows you to do, and the decentralization efforts, for example, that determine how much tax you can raise locally or not, are fundamental for our cities to be more innovative in the future. What is then city government innovation? Where does it take place? We use a taxonomy which at the most fundamental level differentiates processes such as urban democratic and civic innovation, city administrative and organizational innovation, urban finance and procurement, and then of course the data story, and then the two products which any policy domain delivers. On the one hand, direct policy, policy instruments or tools of government, and services provided by the state directly. A few examples to make this less abstract. If we recognize that cities are the integrating force of producing territories, architectures, urban designs, infrastructures, where everything comes together, you need to think about agencies that truly are connecting the dots from often very fragmented national budgets, policies, and also administrative norms. How can you do this? Well, few examples. Transport for London, as a rather cutting edge and quite innovative transport authority, still quite unique in the world, brings together all functions of mobility under one roof. And the mayor appoints the board. So whether it's your streetcar, or it's your sort of managing car use, your taxis, your cyclists, your pedestrians, and so it goes on. It's under one roof and thought about in a complex and coherent way. Long-term strategic thinking and not working with linear futures is another way of being much more innovative and embarking on scenario planning as a default rather than as something that is exceptional. City governments can embrace. Now, on coming back to this issue of dealing with our populations using new forms of public education, but even more importantly, deliberation, citizen assemblies and juries engaging with our communities in new and innovative ways, treating them not as recipient of policies, but inviting them to be part of the policy creation moment is fundamentally important. We run a lot of those workshops, and I'm always surprised how well citizens actually engage in policy-making conversations, how much they understand the city system. You don't have to be an urbanist for this. A few weekends, often we do about 40 hours, and you get to very solid, more consensual decisions around very contested areas. Now, there are two main programs at the LSE. One we have just launched, the Bloomberg LSE European City Leadership Initiative, which has also invited many Ukrainian cities to be part of a journey to advance city government innovation in a cycle of 12 months, where we give a lot of resources, trainings to the mayors, to senior leaders, and the city teams conduct research, which is hopefully something that will remain important also for maybe some of the administration represented here. And we offer for individuals with now a new scholarship program, an executive masters of cities. So this is a master's that is also designed for mayors that are in office. You can do it very part-time to meet counterparts from other parts of the world, senior administrators, people leading in the urban space. And as I said, we have for Europe dedicated quite a considerable budget now for a fully funded scholarship. So let me leave it here. Thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure, as I said, to be with you. And I will stay certainly up until tomorrow morning and hope to now have a very engaging conversation. Thank you. Questions? So now, please.
Thank you for this interesting presentation. I'm from Kiev, and I really don't like how my city looks like right now, because on the small piece of land, sometimes businessmen who are like developers trying to build something you showed on the slide in China. And are there any legal registration in some developed countries to build some limits with the floors to limit these people who just think about the money, but do not think about the urban and about the social impact? Thank you.
Thank you. So, yeah, it's a real conundrum. If you have a very small plot of land that becomes available, the temptation is always to say, you know, let's maximize the value, squeeze out as much floor space out of this, and you get verticalizations, very tall buildings, which may not be very appropriate for these contexts and maybe even alien in terms of their architectural language. The first thing to say is that you can achieve considerable densities of workplaces and also of residencies with, think of central Paris, 6, 7, 8-story buildings. If you do embark in a different design formula about, we call it the perimeter block, where the surface coverage of buildings is probably higher than with your tower. And the towers often are then from your planning laws requiring you to keep a certain distance to the next building. And it creates very disconnected urban space. So many architects and urbanists would come back and say, look, maybe you don't have to have this amount of verticalization, and instead think of a different typology, which is much more attuned to the local condition, but which produces similar densities. So I would not necessarily compromise on the density itself, but have a much more open dialogue about building typology and explore alternatives here. Now, in certain areas, if you then have a choice of maybe building up an entire plot of land or only half of it to protect the other one to become a neighborhood park, you may then want to choose to actually go quite tall for the remainder of the plot. But at least the public then gets a huge benefit out of the other half as a public space, which is a real contribution to the local community. I need to do the moderation, so.
Olga Belyska, one question, very practical one. If we're speaking, maybe two in one. Yes, if we're speaking about the land in the central part of cities, it's very, very expensive. So the construction itself can be economically grounded only in case it is rather high building than low one. So that is an issue. And also we are speaking right now about depolarization. But in case we construct more houses in the central part, it would be economically more expensive, especially due to the growth of price to construction materials, due to the land, which is extremely expensive. And if we limit the height of the building, because right now it becomes more comfortable culturally, architecturally, but much better. So it will be polarization because logically more rich people will live in the central areas, the poor we will have like poor areas somewhere else. So how to combine that? And the second question maybe, but you answered that in between when you were speaking, that all this density should be more comfortable. So it's not only density per se, but the comfort altogether, because we are using cars, we are living outside the cities for our mental well-being, for our better comfort. But usually, if the project selected even by city government and by someone else, for example, in Ukrainian cities, to make it objective, we need to estimate and to select someone on competitive basis, and it's usually based on costs. Who suggests less, he wins. Like even official budget spending on there, and it's not that easy to include quality criteria into this stuff. So a little bit mix of questions, but if I'm pretty sure you know the answers.
No, thank you very much. So let's come back and just unpack this argument a bit more around if there is a central plot of land, it's, yes, most certainly significantly more expensive elsewhere, and therefore you need to, again, squeeze out the maximum and maybe compromise design quality, go more vertical than you want, have more overshadowing, and so on. So I think, and then you compare it with more peripheral development where you may think you have greater opportunity to build at cheaper levels. And we hear this a lot. Building on the periphery is so much cheaper than building in denser urban areas. That can be true, but what we often not including in our, let's say, full cost economic analysis are enormous costs of making relatively low density land available for construction. Because the roads, the pipes, all the infrastructure is often not even calculated into the costs of then developing these cute little dispersed housing developments. So a better full costing analysis of how much money you save if you don't have to go ahead with a huge, more dispersed development allows you to indirectly support something that is more centrally located, that is a higher density, and where you can then carry some of the costs around the quality argument, maybe also through the public. I talked about half being the park, or you want to have a new transit stop. These are sort of the typical considerations. Now, what else can you do? On the design quality front, not all of this needs to be more expensive. I mean, I want to give you a few examples which, in my view, make a huge difference to the quality of living in dense urban areas. And the number one is probably a balcony. Being able to have access to private open space where you can sit outside for breakfast in the summer, or where you can open, makes a massive difference. And in terms of costs, I don't think this is sort of a huge difference, but where you build in inner city areas, allow people the comfort of having personal space outdoors. Roof terraces can be used also as communal outdoor spaces in a much better way, and communal courtyards as something where maybe then several families come together and with a degree of oversight also maybe allow the kids play by themselves because it's not yet fully in the public. Now, an area where there may be higher costs but which has a huge impact on our well-being is the generosity of ceiling heights and also the generosity of the entrances, of how it feels to walk up in these buildings. Is it a very narrow, very small little staircase, or is it something that is welcoming where you can also maybe schlep your tools and bicycles and whatever it may be in an easy way upwards? If it's up to 4, 5, 6 stories, you can do all of this at a square meter cost of construction far cheaper than any other building typology. Where it gets more expensive is if you then go more vertical. You said it, with the ground infrastructure you need to have, the solid foundations, and certainly if you go into the lower density end as well. Now, the city policies that are then negotiating higher quality in areas where maybe developers initially feel, I want to just I need to recover the costs, you also get often back to questions of carrying short and long-term risks. And that gets us to the world of finance. And I'll stop there with the one big observation where we have always seen better urban development, where the investments weren't to offer returns in 2 or 3 years, but in 20, 30, or 40 years. Because at that level, the logic of the people financing aligns with good urbanism. You want to have a successful urban neighborhood where people want to live, where the quality of the building is such that it doesn't crumble after 5 years. You need to then retrofit the facade and so on. The problem and the trade-off really comes when you have money that is impatient and wants to see returns only over 2 years. So with that lens, have a look of how things are financed. Pension funds, much better than sort of equity finance out of the United States, which is very impatient. That makes already a difference.
I have the next question. Okay, my name is Julia Cebulska. I'm the politician, Poltava Regional Council, and I have one precise question to you about the, I saw at one of your slides such a notion as chrono-urbanization. What does it mean and how it affects on the decentralization and resilient urban futures? Thanks.
Great you picked this up. So a lot of conventional planning is all about space. It's three-dimensional, but it doesn't really think about what some people would argue is a fourth dimension of time. If you fully incorporate time, you actually have a huge opportunity to get so much more out of our urban infrastructures and cities. A few examples. Many of the schools in Europe, after the kids leave school, are empty. Huge resources for convenings, for even community activities which can be utilized in the evenings, rented out, sports facilities where local kids could go on meeting in public in areas which up until now often are being locked down. Another good example of chrono-urbanism is to rethink about how we use our streets and public spaces differently at different times of the day. And you can bring in sort of time-based planning, particularly now that with a quick switch on a Mail dashboard, you could almost online change how a street can be used and send a signal out to everyone, now you can drive here, now you can't, now you need to move this way. Opening up during intense retail times, areas for then pedestrians exclusively or otherwise is another example of an opportunity. And then even more mobile units of offering maybe in lower density areas at certain times. I mean, people are experimenting with even mobile city halls where rather than residents always having to go to their administrative offices, you know that on a Thursday at 5 o'clock the local mayoral offices park in front of or in your street and you can do some of the businesses you need to go about, or there is even a retail opportunity. Think of food deserts, another big topic where many residents in many also European cities no longer have access to the right type of food in their neighborhoods at walking distance. You bring time-based planning into the scheme, farmer markets which are there for certain times of the day, of the week. That's all under the big banner of chrono-urbanism.
Thanks a lot, Philip. My question, I would want to go back to the very sad statistics you mentioned about 1/4 not being socialized. What are the solutions? Because partially it's due to COVID and in the case of Ukraine war that we are all online, it keeps us connected. But in the same time, we saw that globally it's also a big challenge, and Australia recently increased the age of kids being able to register account in social networks. And there is probably the big business as Meta and others. So what do you see as a solution? And maybe like what is the role of this very important business, especially in the US, in the opposite supporting this de-socialization?
Great. Let me start telling you a little story from a student of ours in the executive program who is from Cairo. And he started his talk only yesterday, observing that that Egypt has a problem of recruiting the next generation of professional footballers. And the question was like, well, what's happening? Where are the next superstars? Well, it turns out that Cairo and the redevelopment of Cairo has happened in such a way that local kids, often from poor neighborhoods, can no longer play football anywhere in the public streets, anywhere on publicly accessible football courts. If you nowadays want to have a career in football or even enjoy it playing football, it costs you an enormous amount of money. You will go to a club where sort of the training takes place in a more professionalized setting right from the beginning. So this small but rather important story tells us what? We have deprived our children in cities from spaces where they can run around, enjoy themselves, unsupervised, with a high degree of safety and also an ability to socialize and to negotiate life with other human beings. We have deprived them from this for all sorts of reasons. There is, of course, also a worry about all sorts of crime and risks. But the number one driver, just like the Cairo story, it's about reassigning street space away from humans to vehicles, to dedicate more and more space to parking, more and more space to driving, more and more space to individualized forms of transport. So if you inverse this, that clearly is a number one issue, and particularly neighborhood streets, allowing the kids to once again kick a ball, be out from an early age, even at 4 or 5 years, will make a huge difference. I don't believe, and I've seen this with my own kids, I don't believe when you provide them with the opportunity to be together in space and have fun together, that the attraction of online gaming and online media is so big that they will not go out of the house. It's actually hugely attractive to them to have fun with each other. And there was a fascinating moment of all my colleagues in Spain and Portugal when they had the power cut, and maybe these are observations you have also seen here. They had 24 hours, no electricity. And within 1 hour, the city streets were full of children playing. Why? Because they didn't have their mobiles Internet was off. What to do? They all went out. That also means there is proactive policy intervention on the other end. And of course, we need to regulate collectively how children use digital devices in a much, much better way as well.
It means that electricity, as you taught in your lecture, is the problem just for the urban.
Yeah.
The same problem for social life.
Yeah. In fact, it was less electricity because you have the battery. It was that the internet no longer worked. That was the moment when they went out, right? Yeah.
So we found the solution right now.
Switch the internet off, yes, and the kids will be out.
Yeah, Philip, short question from my side. Thanks for presentation. My will be probably on more strategic, actually, advice from your side. So, who is actually deciding what to do in the city? Basically, we have administration, we have mayors and the whole cabinet of the mayor, and we have members of the city council. These people not necessarily, and most probably never been involved in any kind of education and actual experience how to operate within the city. So that's people who were doing their private businesses, and they are also private interest, and it's actually, I think, all over. It's not only Ukrainian case. So the mayor and the city council members, they are basically inheriting the legacy what was before, and from Ukrainian side it's that Soviet actually legacy that we've got, and most probably in most of the areas this is not the best actually examples that we received. So my question is actually how to make a difference with all of these people who actually have their own maybe interests. They don't have clear understanding how the city should move. And we can see examples of some of the cities which are more effective or more quickly developed. And it's not only about the budget. So it's not necessarily the budget is the most important issue. So, and the others are still actually developing very slowly. Because for us, it's now also the case. So how we are actually, because you mentioned many very important topics within your presentation, and there might be some strategy in place for each of the city long term for the 50 whatever years for each of the area, and it's actually take like very I would say unique understanding that the city would need, and to put the city's actually needs prior the yours. So how you see it, how we can do it in Ukraine.
Thank you very much. So I guess there are 3 points I want to highlight. And the first is the most obvious, and coming from a university, when you ask me about what if people aren't aware, haven't been trained for it, the part of the answer needs to be to offer precisely that, to allow them to be exposed to a more urban-centric type of understanding and go through a renewed form of education program, which isn't in the traditional sense sort of telling them what to do, but to engage with peers and hopefully get inspired and excited about being part of building the next generation of cities. Now, in conversations with some mayors, they will have always highlighted to me that there are certain people you can put them into endless amount of meetings and educational contexts, they will not change, and they will continue doing this. And if, now you won't be able to change elected officials, that's harder, but if you are within your administration and you realize you have there are a fraction of individuals who just do not want to engage even in thinking things through differently, you may have to embark in opportunities of changing role profiles. And mayors have told me that was the only thing in many instances that unlocked the city's opportunity to go into a new era of doing things. Now, the second thing is to inspire. And I think that in the UK case has had a huge impact in urban development, in particular in London. Not only that the politicians started to travel a bit more across Europe, but certainly also our populations. And if there's one benefit of cheap air travel, it's that one. And people went to Spain and to Italy and to Switzerland, and they came back with this very simple question: why can't our city look more like what I like during my holidays? When I came to London in the late 1990s, there wasn't a single street cafe. Just the concept didn't exist. The idea of sitting outside with a cappuccino and drinking on a pavement is something that was seen as, well, that's what the Italians do, or the Spaniards. If you go to London now over the summer, it will be full of that. And we will have widened in inner London almost every single pavement by at least 50 centimeters, if not more. Huge redistribution of street space as a result of those kind of experiences. So that's, I think, a second very important component. And the third one, that gets you closer to, I guess, sort of a policy-making cycle where through new gained legitimacy of a mayor, I mean, we're seeing this again and again, where having been voted in, I mean, watch out what's happening in New York City is fascinating with Mamdani, voted on a very strong progressive ticket, having a lot of legitimacy to change things, and maybe doing, connecting that kind of political capital they have with new forms of deliberative engagement, saying like, look, I'm not only relying on the election night, I really seek the dialogue, and I'm setting up assemblies and new forms of engagement, not just polling and not just who is against and for something, but seeking real conversation with randomly selected citizens. I think then is sort of the third formula that has driven a lot of cities into the much more dynamic, the much more innovative and maybe progressive space.
Just a technical announcement. First of all, the disturbing sounds you're hearing, the fact that we are actually on a basically a shooting range for the military and for the veterans. So they're just shooting somewhere. So that the sound, the pumping sound that you hear, it's peaceful shooting. It's don't you worry. And the second is basically we have time for one more question, probably maximum two. So yeah, you had your arm.
Thank you very much, Philip. As usual, it was excellent lecture. Thanks for this inspiring. My question will go to the resilience and to the energy and about the balance between that. Because when we have power outage for just for 1 minute, for example, for such huge city like New York City, it cost billions. Before the full-scale invasion into Ukraine, on the top of the agenda in the EU, it was Green Deal. And we heard a lot about the huge investments in alternative energy, green energy, but I never heard, at least in public on the highest level, discussion about the investments of the backups. And in Ukraine, I mean backups of the energy system. And now in Ukraine, every Ukrainian knows very well what does it mean blackouts, what does it mean blackouts for 24 hours, 72 hours. And it shows very clearly how all sectors of the economies and all the part of our daily lives depended from the electricity. And all these discussions about the Green Deal and about the alternative way of energy shows in Ukraine that they cannot be the standalone solution. Because now we once again prove that the more reliable and the most reliable at that moment, the source is the generators and fuel. So, and in this case, we just challenging the future developments with the Green Deal and alternative energy, and just took one step back to the fourth way, or I suppose on your chart it was fourth day, when the oil and fuel just still played the most important role for the cities and for the world economy. And it's sometimes, you know, it's from some points even ridiculous, because at 2025, for example, we again just can raise the price for the oil on the world market, because we really need these generators and fuel for them, which is absolutely not about the Green Deal, definitely. But as much as faster the city's development, the energy more and more important for the whole, all sectors of our lives. So from your your own vision, from your perspective, where is this balance between energy dependent to make the cities resilient, but also to think about the energy, ecological and the environment among all itself? Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I'm sure this is exactly one of the areas where the rest of Europe will have so much to learn from what you have been doing in Ukrainian cities. So it's really important to mention that. It also allows me to emphasize again that, you know, decentralization you can read on the one hand as a political process. On the other hand, this is about also introducing new, for example, with microgrids, new structures of decentralized resilience where a bigger grid collapse doesn't result in then collapse in all neighborhoods, in all areas of a city. And that form of decentralized logic, I think, speaks also to the urban condition we're looking for. Now, much more specifically about the generators and the conflict, they are still very sort of highly polluting and carbon emitting. There is an enormous hope that on the battery technology we'll get into a space where, as part of microgrids, and some people argue even already today, the charging electric vehicles are ultimately also backups, at least for the first 24 hours, maybe 12 hours, in case the grid is down. But we are certainly seeing an enormous increase in the efficiency of batteries. I would not be surprised if we have in buildings as a backup a very high-performing battery pack, which helps us with this, also with the energy transition and the price fluctuation more generally. And maybe also there's a hydrogen solution to this in parts as well, where you have that as a backup storage. But I think I would almost flip it around. I think this is where, me included, we have to listen to what you tell us. You testing it every other day, you know about it, you have the first-hand experience, and also the cost equation. Oh, final point, also, the energy efficiency story, we must not lose sight of it. You know, this building hopefully is 10 times more energy efficient in terms of space heating and all sorts of other things than it used to be. And if we get the urban composition right, there are areas where we can dramatically reduce carbon, the electricity demand, and overall energy consumption. Final question, I think, yeah.
Thank you, Philip, for this lecture. My question will be regarding both socializing and infrastructure. Despite I'm now living in Kyiv, I am I born in Transcarpathia region. It's the western part of Ukraine. As you know, it's the safest territory of Ukraine now. And we have a big, really huge increasing of population, especially in cities and small and biggest. And my question will be very practically, what do you think, where is the high time, where is the right time to construct kindergartens, schools in the area of the cities? Because of infrastructure problems like as roads, like facilities and the pipes and so on, it's doing, yeah. But as for places for children in kindergartens, in school, it's private and public sector, both. It's a huge problem of the social living there. Where is the right time?
Acoustically, this was did you say the right time or the right type of?
Right time, and if you want, yes, if you can give advice, what type of planning, if it's a good time to plan the buildings and also plan actually the kindergarten and school, and no other option for the city plan.
And when you think about time, you know, think of the next 10 years in relation to population growth, electoral cycles, or crisis points, summer, winter. What do you mean the right time?
Time of decision making about this kindergarten and that school, with all the with all the buildings that increasing on that place.
Yeah. The first thing I would say, I'm not an expert specifically in how you build these social infrastructures, but the moment you develop your strategic plans, the citywide plans, and you are thinking about the distribution of these key social functions, you should already have some sense of what your broad targets are, and to then identify areas that are underserved. And for the underserved areas where you are not performing at the desirable levels, i.e. 500 meters access or a kilometer access, walking access ideally, to a school, to a kindergarten, to a nursery, you would on that basis then understand better how is that neighborhood maybe densifying, developing, how many more people are coming, to then prioritize these neighborhoods in accordance to where the demand is most rapidly increasing. Sadly, in London, we now have inner city areas where it's the inverse. We are starting to close school because we seem to have such an affordability problem of living in the inner city that young families are moving out, and we have an actual absolute reduction in inner London of young children. So that's then the inverse. And it's, of course, a very dangerous thing to now convert schools into apartments, because maybe in 10 years we need them again. So in that sense, that will be my answer to right time. Thank you. Talking about right time, it's the right time to break and have a lunch. Thank you very much. Not yet? Okay, I'll pass it.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Now I'm back, and from experience, I've discovered that you listen better when it's in English, so I will go on in English. It will be a little bit more inclusive to our esteemed guests from the US and Britain. So, despite the confusion, this was not yet the group discussion. This was just the Q&A session. The group discussion will be held now 1 hour until lunch. The lunch will happen at 2:30 according to the plan. So, because any knowledge is useless until you try to practice what you've got to know, we are offering you actually to divide yourselves in groups and discuss what you've heard and try to figure out some solutions on the level of competence that you have. Because, as Philip said, some questions that you are asking, probably you have the right answers to, because neither Europe nor other parts of the world have this expertise, have this experience of living in the times of ongoing war. And we have a perfect illustration to that. Right now we will be brainstorming and discussing solutions in groups while hearing the shooting. So this is exactly what we are going to do. Now I am inviting you to join into 5-person groups. So if you're too many, please divide a little bit. There's more tables. Each table around 5 people. And we also, let us arrange in space for that. Okay, we have several groups. Good. The team also is distributing some of the papers and markers, etc. What I invite you to do is first choose a scribe, a litopisец, who will write down all your brainstorming stuff on the colored papers, the small, please, guys, I will talk for 3 minutes more, and then you will talk for 30. So let us just divide the resources efficiently. That's important. So, got stuck with the ones you have and you want to keep on with them. And please welcome Chris Alden. I think everybody knows him, so please welcome Chris Alden to the stage.
Thank you very much. I'm going to discuss, I'm very glad to be here. I guess I should stand on the stage. Let's do that. I'm going to talk about regions, and I'm going to talk about how the global system is changing, and speak to the specifics of what I see to be one of the major assets that Ukraine has, and that is critical minerals. And what we would like today is to give you some background about this. Some of you will already have that some information from your jobs or what have you. But what we'd like to do is consolidate that, talk about some hard choices as regards to how to strategically go forward, to think forward in a manner that would plan out the responses, develop policy, etc., for Ukraine in order to be prepared to take advantage of this relative strength it has in this critical sector. Why this sector? The green economy, the post-carbon economy is dependent on it. Our very technically oriented material, from the phones to the electric vehicles, are all dependent on it, as you know. So that's why I thought I'd put this front and center and make this both a lecture, but also a Q&A, and then finally group work around policy making, strategizing, policy making. Okay? Yeah. Yes, I already broke the rules here once. In my first few minutes. Yes, I'll try to stand. I'll try to stay on this side. Okay. So global supply chains, critical minerals, and Ukraine. Okay. And what I want to talk to specifically first is set a context here. Let's talk about the context of change within the global system, the international political economy, the degree to which it is moving away from that aspiration. It was never completely fulfilled, but that aspiration of a fully globalized sort of universal set of rules guiding the trade, economic issues, freedom of free-flowing capital, freedom ultimately of movement and labor at the other end of the chain, trade relatively unencumbered. That was the globalization dream, as it were. And that's what had, since 1945, that was the system that was gradually being put into place over the time, through the Cold War, and accelerating with the end of the Cold War. So that political economy context. The second context is to look at a leader, the leader, in fact, in critical minerals. And as you know, that's China. And it's really a story not just of it acting in it, of it just inheriting this or its geographic position. It's actually strategic positioning. And in looking at the Chinese case, I think we can read through that what sort of long-term planning is required, what sort of forward projection, thinking, etc., is necessary to achieve, particularly in the mining sector. Mining sector has certain constraints, right? It takes a certain life cycle for mines to be both developed and then the cost benefit over a period of time, and then mines become exhausted. They become no longer utilizable, or it's too costly to develop them. So that context, critical minerals, and how China has positioned itself as a leader in the post-carbon economy. Then I'd like us to, then I'll bring us to the point of a Q&A, and then talking about group work, how to position. That's your job. That's my job is done then. I'll be on the beach over there. No, I will still be around, but sorry. How Ukraine can think about a world after war, a world where critical minerals, that advantage it has, it's entering into a market, how does it position itself to respond to rising demand in this area, to the European Union in particular as a player, to its own interests, and in fact, not being exclusively reliant upon Global Gateway and those sorts of avenues of supply chain management. So this sort of stuff, I think I'd like to hear from you. You would talk to each other in group form. We're going to present. We're going to talk about public sector responses, private sector responses, and the like. So all of that. Okay, let's start with just a general comment about the global political economy. That it's changing. It's more regional, right? Even than it was 4 or 5 years ago. COVID was part of the kind of kickstart on that. But in fact, what we have now with the rise of great power competition, the United States pushing this, accelerating this process, we have a world where competition, realignment of where supply chains are based is increasingly done not on efficiency basis. I think you've heard me say one or two of these things about, but rather on a geopolitical basis, right? So no longer efficiency, but geopolitical. What were the drivers of that? The COVID period was the first shock, right? You could not access certain key supplies. Trade had ground to a halt in certain respects. There were problems even in geographic terms. You saw the Suez Canal, one of the regular conduits north and south from the Indian Ocean and Asia to into the European markets, silting up or having trouble with some of the cargo ships that would go. And that communicated to countries in Europe, countries around the world, that the certainties of global trade were no longer certain. That you couldn't get everything you wanted out of that behemoth manufacturing source of China. So what that produced was the beginning of a review of those lengthy and complex global supply chains. Companies now pursued nearshoring, right? They took what had been dependency or an expectation of being able to bring in low labor cost produced particular items into building them into a particular larger product, and they realigned those or reasserted them as in markets that were closer to the home market. That logic of bringing it closer helps this process of moving towards regionalization. You know this one, right? 747 Boeing. If you look at the different countries, you can't produce like this anymore, and expect that it's always going to work, right? You've got a distribution of parts, production, technology, innovation across this very complicated airplane. And finally, the stamp in Seattle at the Boeing field, which gives it the imprint of an American plane, but in fact, it's really a global plane as far as production goes. This kind of thing continues, but it's vulnerable. And that sense of vulnerability to in any particular component of the supply chain and the production process is what gave people pause. Okay, they must rethink it. I want to point out one thing with this, however. When we talk about nearshoring or friendshoring, those of you who could read this closely will see that, in fact, it's already in many ways friendshored. There are a few things from China, a few things from countries that might be a question, Chengdu Aircraft International and the like. But in an odd way, it anticipated this particular aeronautics piece anticipates some elements of nearshoring. Oops, go back to here. Okay, So building supply chain resilience then moves from in the post-COVID era to the era of global great power competition into an imperative. States have to realign themselves, reconfigure their companies have to rather, and states as well, facilitating this into the friendshoring, bringing production closer to home. What this does is this boosts inter-regional trade, okay? And so what you have with the intra-regional trade and inter-regional trade. So the world is becoming less about a universal globalized connectivity built by making choices around how you produce, where you source raw materials, et cetera, along that logic of efficiency, and it's increasingly one that is bounded by regions. So understanding how regions, what the world looks like, this gives us some sense of the future. I'm not saying it's prediction, that's not what it's always dangerous to predict. But what we can see are patterns of trade, patterns that are strongly suggestive of regional, devolution of globalization where we have a stronger regional imprint, okay? And these growth patterns are particularly strong in Asia. Asia's taking the lead, and in that context, Asian regionalism is supported and driven by Chinese commercial power, its financial power, its market power. All of those things are behind that kind of regionalization there. There's a similar process, but it's not moving as quickly. It's partly the war itself here, right, which is both accelerates the idea that we have to have a more regional base for trade, but at the same time, it also puts barriers to full regionalization. So EU vulnerability to shocks was evident, as it was for other countries and regions, and out of that became a policy which actively sought to realign or encourage alignment in trade terms, in investment terms, that would provide the framework for a more secure sourcing of raw materials, research, and the resources and the like. So from that are trade agreements, strategic partnerships, and an emphasis on domestic capacity as well. So that package of things is part of that. In this context, Ukraine is in a strong position. I think you know that story. That was all about the debates around critical minerals, the degree to which Ukraine has what Europe needs or other countries need, the United States, et cetera, et cetera. And in that respect, it's not just about critical minerals, it's about agriculture as well, that these are resources both in their raw form, but in their processed form that can be exported into European markets, and in that sense, bind the economies of Ukraine even further with European interests. It already exists, but this is a vehicle for doing so with an accompanying logic that is not just a market logic. It's a logic related to to great power competition more generally, and bolstering is the EU's ability to withstand shocks of these kinds. So 22 of 34 critical minerals are based here. The geographic position in terms of transportation argues for it. Again, I'm speaking to things you're aware of. Overland transportation, also maritime through the Black Sea, where agriculture goods have been going. The existing infrastructure, never mind, of course, the destruction of it recently, but the possibility of new infrastructure that is part of EU-Ukrainian discussions and indeed projects. The EU as a region that itself wants to develop and accelerate the post-carbon economy. So the rationale for the minerals, the idea that the EU needs them in order to build electric vehicles and other related sorts of things. The Global Gateway puts that together, the strategic partnership with Ukraine as well. In that context, the larger question that I want you to keep in mind, and again, you may already be thinking about this, is critical minerals and its unique position in relationship to the European Union offer a unique opportunity for a post-conflict, post-war Ukrainian economy to integrate more thoroughly with Europe. But at the same time, it's a global player in this. And sorry, I'm not supposed to stand in front of that. So at the same time, it's a global player. And in that context, it's not just a discussion between the EU and Ukraine. It's within a larger context of a sector that is dominated by China. So the question the area I want to talk about now is how did it get there? What is the degree to which it is dominant, and what are the implications of that? So as you're starting to think about what it is Ukraine can and should do in order to take advantage of the relative strengths in critical minerals, what is it that ought to be done? What ought to be done first is I take a sip of water. Okay, so what's the mapping of China in this sector look like? Well, in terms of production side of critical minerals, we have to note first and foremost that these are highly concentrated geographically, right? And that alone should raise the questions about security of supply. For instance, particular ones like cobalt, 70% of the supplies that are circulating today are from the Democratic Republic of Congo, okay? So far away, long transport lines and linkages. China itself holds 60% of the rare earth elements. There's some dispute about that figure, but that was at least a publicly cited figure. There are more sources of rare earths around the globe that are being discovered because now they are meaningful and therefore, for instance, Portugal in lithium has deposits of lithium. So there are other sources being found or rediscovered all the time. Nickel, Indonesia, 40%, Australia. Between Australia and Chile, they count for nearly 80% of all the lithium mining. So if that's production side, the supplies of, the other is the processing side. And here China has a distinctive advantage. The refining of rare earths, 90%, okay? 60 to 70% of lithium and cobalt. So China has invested in and sustained its position in these rare earths or critical minerals. And it's a very polluting process. I know you have, in the eastern part of the country, you have similar sorts of processing capabilities that have been working in the past and I think continue to work, at least some partially so. China dominates the bulk material supply, accounting for 50% of crude steel, cement, aluminum output. So it actually has a real controlling position in a variety of minerals, the processing of the minerals, its licensing position in terms of overseas arrangements and the like. So all of those taken collectively have put China in the pole position, the dominant position in these sectors. You can see it sort of, if you're looking worldwide, you can see the other sources of critical minerals, the 18, and we can see they're spread out around the globe, but China has a preponderant position. So that's a sort of comment on the competition, if you like, right? Oops, that was fast. Okay. And again, on the processing side, you can see how China, again, specific copper, nickel, aluminum, it's the red that is the Chinese processing capability and prominence relative to other sources. So you have Chile, in lithium and in copper, the blue. But you can see that China has not only invested, it's secured that position. In fact, other countries like the United States has closed down effective processing, which it had at some capability at some point, and chosen to draw its supply its markets from that angle. So just to give you a sense of scale of this, South America. So how did this happen? Was it an accident? Was it commercially driven? No, the point is it was actually strategically developed, okay? So there's a lot of, there's a lot of chatter you'll hear about Chinese strategic planning and the like. You know, the long-term Western firms operate on a quarterly basis, right? And Chinese take hundreds of years of forethought or what have you. I wouldn't just take that with a pinch of salt. I would take it with a very, very big block of salt. That being said, there is planning, absolutely. And maybe in a world where there's an absence of planning elsewhere, that planning looks pretty strategic and looks pretty robust. Okay, so keeping in mind that for just the classic case was, you will have heard of that statement, Zhou Enlai. He was interviewed by French media I think in about 1970, and they asked him what was reported in the media. They asked him, "What do you think of the French Revolution?" And he said, "It's too early to tell." Right? In fact, that's a mistranslation. His translation was wrong, and in fact, what he thought they were talking about 1968 in the streets of Paris. In fact, and the others thought that the French media thought he was talking about the French Revolution in that sense. So it was quite a kind of classic misunderstanding. But in any case, China does plan. It's partly linked to the Enduring Command Economy 5-year plan stuff. And it's not a hidden secret. You can go read this stuff yourself, right? You should be reading this. If you're in this market, you should be reading this, and you'll get a vision of what China, its diagnosis of what the issue is, right? The availability, the position of China in that sector, the necessity of it to become a major player. This is just one national mineral resource plan in 2016, okay, before it ran from 2016 to 2020. China was not the dominant player yet, but they were planning to invest resources and position itself as such. It recognizes first, domestically, that China was the largest consumer of minerals, but still itself was just a mid-stage. It was at a mid-stage in terms of industrialization. It also recognized that in order to sustain its industrial position, it had to get minerals from outside, critical minerals from outside. It was not enough to rely on its domestic resources. Okay, so self-diagnosis of this, and then asking what is the route to addressing this problem. Noted in the report is the sense that critical minerals or resource security more broadly, and within that critical minerals has always been a core issue for a country that is seeking to develop. And the key word here is not just develop, but be sustainably developed. In other words, they need that constant supply chain in order to maintain the industrial process and move forward and keep their people employed and achieve their long-term goals to become a medium-sized, developed, developed economy by 2030. The mineral sector employs a lot of people. Key thing, if you read the report, you'll see they make it quite clear. Even though this is the same era when the post-carbon economy is beginning, investment in the post-carbon economy is beginning to take place, nonetheless, they themselves say there is a place for traditional industries. They're not going to abandon that. They're going to go with both, as it were. So they're building a world that is about sustaining, opening a coal fire plant every month, right? That was what was happening at the same time as developing the solar industry and capacity. They said it's not a sunset. They explicitly say this is not a sunset industry for us, okay? So they're keeping that for a variety of reasons. They're betting on the future, but they're also sustaining the current for employment reasons, as a hedge, I suppose, as well. The other thing is that they recognize that mining minerals, securing minerals, but also being in the dominant position in mineral processing helps them in price setting, so they can get a better price for this particular item, that they could, in that context, help them to develop a Chinese value chain that runs the entire production cycle, right? They're going to be not just the supplies itself, the processing, the shipping itself, by ports, as you'll see in a minute, using Chinese transport means, using Chinese logistics, etc., all the way down to the production at home, the refining, and then finally into the actual manufacturing and or production process. Yeah, so it's connected to infrastructure too. So this initiative, you will have heard, the Belt and Road Initiative, is very much aligned with this, okay? And the idea that China becomes, through the development of greater infrastructure, the development financing of these goods, using its finance, using its tied aid, using its own contractors, using its labor supplies, using even some of the cements, the steels, and all of that sort of stuff. Using that will help improve the transports of minerals, both from the original suppliers and in their finished form to the markets that they want to produce. To get the lithium out of the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and then shipping it to the finished product of the electric car to the markets in Europe or North America. So, and why have governments responded so readily to China? Why have they borrowed from China to help develop infrastructure? Well, one of the reasons is they spoke to the interests and concerns of those governments. Those interests and concerns were to have fast, secure resources, banking, financing for infrastructure projects, and to do so quickly and to do so without conditions. European Union lending does what? It requires, has all sorts of conditions, political conditions, human rights, et cetera, et cetera. So no problem in Beijing, no problem. You'll get the money without that. That sort of stuff combined with an ideology, an ideological position of non-interference has meant that governments were very often these resource supply, these governments that were dominated, their economies were dominated by resource exports and the like. They welcomed that non-interference. They had themselves had experienced interference by Western sources. They didn't like relying just on Western sources, and as a consequence of that, they were very open to diversifying their partnerships and their financing of development and infrastructure to China. So but this had a virtue. It wasn't just about lending and in itself for infrastructure. What happens is we see that China is building the very conditions it needs to lower costs and assure the supply, a secure supply chain back to China. Develop new markets, facilitate urbanization as well there, cluster production, et cetera. So it was a very positive, a virtuous cycle being produced here. This is a report produced by Dalian Maritime University looking at East Africa, saying how do we get those minerals? We need to build railroads and roads, right? And posited the way that the routes that they would take, through what countries, etc. Okay, not all of those projects came to fruition. Again, they're putting it to the universities to think about these issues, to begin to plan out or to play out different scenarios where resources were secured and would do so over a period of time, and put a timeline to it, a costing to it, etc. I found this one in scientific journals translated into English. So you can just see a number of these things. Let's again zoom down to the particular case of lithium, because it matters to the electric car market, okay? And let's look at lithium and Latin America. So what we have seen since the 1990s is a conscious effort to position by Chinese firms, state-owned firms, to gain or secure licenses to mine in, or partnerships, joint ventures with Chilean firms in the lithium sector, Argentinian firms in that area, and also even Bolivian firms, though that the supplies there are much more costly and complicated to get. So China's position, therefore, has been one of recognizing it needs resources, it needs to make the choices and provide the financing attached to that, as far back as the 1990s, and it was a diligent process. It wasn't going to happen overnight. It was something over time. For instance, in the lithium trade, a German firm had secured from the Bolivian government a long-term license, but it didn't actually engage in mining. It had the license, the right to do so, but it wouldn't invest into it because of 2008, the global financial crisis. It couldn't muster up the resources to do so. And so the Bolivian government exercised its right to cancel that and turn it over to a Chinese firm, which was much more willing and had the financial capability to do so. So that sort of pattern is one of them that we saw. Upstream, we see Chinese lithium production accelerating, and this is partly a projection into the future as well. We see battery manufacturing downstream, and this is in competition with the United States. You can't even see on the lithium supply side U.S. positions, I think. It's that very light blue there, right? So there isn't even a U.S. position in that regard. Downstream, there's some competition in terms of manufacturing. Investing in infrastructure in Argentina. This is not just about lithium, it's as much about agriculture. Those of you, I know people here are in the agricultural sector, the soybean production, right? They rebuilt the railways, the Argentinian railways to port, okay? And in that way, they prepared the ground for a shift when it came out of the dependency and engagement with U.S. soy production, right? And they had it on tap, as it were, another source in Argentina. Again, port facilities being rebuilt, trains, also railway infrastructure being rebuilt. So, in the end, what does China have? It has a collection from mines and salt lakes. It has, you can see the different companies there that are involved. You can see, and their competitors as well, Canadian U.S. firm, Albemarle, as opposed to Tianqi and other firms, Ganfeng. Lithium salt extraction, lithium batteries, manufacturing of new energy vehicles and charging equipment. So up and down, they dominate, okay? And that was from even preceding 2016, but certainly accelerating from that point. So both having a dominant position in the old carbon side, right, and in the upcoming future clean energy supply chain. And how does it do it? It was, as I said, it was partly about acquisitions. it was also about, increasingly, it's about greenfield investments. Okay, so it has a mix of the two. And its investment is global, truly global in manufacturing. It's and strategically placed, for instance, in Mexico, in the northern Sonora state, so that it can access US markets to compete head-to-head with Tesla, etc. I was in the Azores, actually, a summer ago, and BYD, which is one of the leading electric car vehicles, as you may know, they have offices there. They're not offices, they're sales rooms there, right? So they're actually in a small island as well as offshore Africa or center of the Atlantic, but also all over Europe, all over the UK, etc. And the overseas factories themselves, you can see, look at how they're placed. Hungary is the country that is producing the BYD's brand. There are alternatives as well on the cards, perhaps. So we're seeing a very strategic approach to this. So that's what I want to say about China and how it got to where it went. It thought about it, I should say. It put resources towards it. It recognized that to position itself there and to achieve sort of market dominance, it needed to invest not just in getting the licenses themselves and perhaps the production facilities on the other end, that the key was processing, that's what's enabled them to stop and start with in terms of when it's sought to block access to rare earths and the like. Yes. Okay.
From my perspective, it looks like China will owe the world very soon, or everyone in the world will depend on China. And by 2030, I know China would have a capacity, the nuclear capacity as the United States. So this is like a pretty scary situation. But the question is, China is a communist country. And they can actually do this strategic planning and assess and look into the future. Question is, do democratic countries can do the same? And why the other countries were not able or not willing to do similar things? So what is in the core of that strategic thinking as well?
First, about China's strategic, I agree, command economy. I think that the habit, as it were, the institutionalization of the 5-year plan means you have a kind of periodic review and a forward projection. So that has some utility. It doesn't mean actually it's efficiently allocated, and it doesn't mean, what I've seen on the Chinese side, if you want to unpack what doesn't work well, is de facto they continue to have targets, and the targets aren't necessarily defined by, they're defined by output, by numbers. So in other words, we need to achieve, they still think in terms of we can take losses in order to achieve market dominance, but they measure it in terms of trade volumes, for instance. They won't necessarily measure it in terms of quality positions there. I'm not saying that they don't also have that, but it does. When we think planning doesn't always, it doesn't look as overwhelming when you see the output as it would appear. That being said, we've done pretty well. They went from a non-dominant position to one that is quite the opposite now. Western governments, Western firms, the short-term profit, the short-term the two things I would say, simply put, the short-term review, quarterly review profit. To see profit discourages long-term planning. You're very short. There's the contemporary nature dominates. Secondly, there's the electoral cycles, right? So again, there's a kind of political form of the quarterly review, as it were, so that people the politicians are thinking about their political survival that responding to constituency concerns sometimes that don't argue for long-term planning and sometimes long-term pain, right, taxation and what have you. And so they try to make decisions. They make decisions in that context which ultimately are not strategic in nature. They're the short-termism in both cases. Are you, if you, yeah, no, I hear. I am thinking that no, nobody's doomed. Let's start with that. But I think that it means that one has to rethink those effective planning cycles that stop you from making long-term decisions, right? Long-term planning, rather, strategic planning. So I think that's part of it. I think that democracies have demonstrated that they can plan long-term. Okay, the European Union would not exist if there wasn't very conscious efforts to facilitate integration incrementally, so selecting particular sectors where they thought integration would both make logical economic sense, economies of scale and the like, but would do so in a way that would be would naturally and have to be disruptive of, for instance, the steel production in Europe. So they were thinking strategically with that, and they rolled it out in those areas where they had a kind of common agreement, and they then took other sectors and developed pursued a similar set of policies. So I think we had long-term policy, we had long-term planning in Western democracies. The comment may be about neoliberalism, it may be about the kind of immediacy that came with and hubris that came with globalization. It might be that kind of thing that explains it. Yeah.
Become very chaotic.
I also think that I will blame academics in a way. There was this ethos that the collapse of the Soviet Union meant the end of history, there was no sort of critical thinking that followed that, right? We'd achieved everything. It's just a matter of sort of tinkering at the edges, drawing other countries into the democratic fold, and that would be sufficient. That in itself, there were no problems with the current approach of globalization. It wouldn't produce vast inequalities, therefore giving rise to the populist pushback and all of that.
US independent from the Chinese materials from 2 to 10 years dependent materials. But I'm not sure that this Besant's plan will be realized by the current administration. So the question not in the plans as the plans, but the realization, leadership, and coordination between institutions. I feel that this is a main problem. The same for European Union. In fact, we have a Draghi report, and even leadership by Ursula von der Leyen in making EU competitive again. But it will not be realized because of democracy, because of weaknesses of democracy, I feel.
I would say, just to add to that and to sort of round it out, I would say also the end of industrial policy. Why do democratic states stop thinking about industrial policy? They had all, the EU and all the things we were talking about had very strong industrial policy approaches and what have you. They abandoned it because they believe in globalization. We don't need to be the ones that manufacture. We don't need this high-cost national production on this. We can seek out through markets, we can access this, we can build those tremendous supply chains. That logic prevailed. It prevailed until the countries and that, like China, that were competitive, were starting to exercise economic statecraft. For instance, they punished the Japanese for not pursuing policies domestically that they liked, and other policies towards island chains and the like. And so that sort of strategic use of their dependency position was something that began to wake up, but perhaps wake up not too late, but certainly wake up policymakers in those settings. Yes, any other questions there? Okay, so it's a snapshot. There's a lot of detail here that I'm not going into. It's a lot of detail that you may be yourselves familiar with, okay? But what I'd like you to do, and what we would like you to do is the following, is I'd like you to break up into groups, help develop a set of policy recommendations for positioning Ukraine in a post-carbon economy. What the resources that we've said, the unique, not unique, but maybe unique in Europe resources, how does one take those resources, that capacity, also in terms of processing that we've mentioned, right, around rare earths and critical minerals, and devise a plan that would address the following issues. One, Ukraine's post-war reconstruction needs, capital, labor, the role of veterans in that process, infrastructure. Second, Ukraine's overall policy to fit it within its overall policy of strengthening the relationship between and integration with the European Union, as befits the strategic plan. Partnership, rather. 3, Ukraine's aspirations to create value-added production through critical minerals and develop the production capacity more generally. In other words, you don't want to be just an exporter of unprocessed minerals. You want that value added so that you end up with greater employment and also other positive cycles in that regard. 4, the policy concerns around diversification and dependency. What about other markets than the European Union? Which leads me to the other and last point, which is there's a context. You're competing with a China that dominates. How do you operate in that setting? So I don't have the answers to this. I've got a few thoughts on it. What I like about this group here is collectively you actually have a lot of the answers, right? You know this. I want you to sit together and make that plan up, right? Work in your group. Think about how you're going to position this country, you as government officials and private sector. Think both about government and private sector. Let me turn it over to Anastas.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So please give a round of applause to Chris. And now some technical information about how are we actually doing that. Можна, будь ласка, повернути слайд, який був, щоб він був у нас перед очима постійно. Я попрошу, якщо можна, світло додати сюди в простір. I invite you to join again into the groups of 5 to 6 people, maybe new ones, maybe you want to work with somebody else, maybe the way you were before. It's your choice, make it wise. And we are basically working in the same frame. You use the color papers to note your ideas, and then you pick and choose and maybe elaborate a little and adapt them, and pick and choose, okay, how many do we do? Like 5 key ideas.
No more than 5?
No more than 5 ideas per group, but this time, we will divide you, we will give you a little bit separate tasks. So please arrange yourselves into the groups, and with the power given to me by Chris, I will now pronounce you, the groups to my right, on your left, you will be developing the solutions and policies of the private sector. you and you, two groups that work separately but on the private sector solutions.